Hello, I'm Helen Bradley. Welcome to this video tutorial. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how you can do a hand-drawn knitting illustration in Illustrator. Before we get started with this video tutorial, let's have a look and see what it is that we're trying to achieve. We're actually going to create this piece of hand-drawn knitting in Illustrator. You're going to see how to put all the pieces together. Here's another piece that's not quite as complete. It doesn't have a second knitting needle in it, but you can see the kind of effect that you'll be able to achieve using this technique. To begin our knitted shape, we're going to create the actual stitches, and for this I'm going to use a rounded rectangle. I'm going to draw a rounded rectangle that is around half the width of its height. So if I have one as I do here that's about 50 points wide, I want it to be about 100 points long. Now I'm not worried about these exact dimensions. I don't want you to be concerned that you have to get everything exactly right. You just need to have it around twice as wide as it is tall. And for now we're just going to have a fill and a stroke color, but we're going to work on those a little bit later on. But let's just put something in there now so we can see what we're working with. Now I want to shear this, so with it selected, I'm going to target Object, Transform, Shear. And this is a value that you probably will want to get. You want to shear it around minus 17 degrees in a horizontal direction. So just angle that to minus 17 degrees horizontal direction and just click OK. And this is one of the stitches, but we want to rotate it as well. So I'm just going to drag on one of its corner handles to rotate it, and I want to rotate it about minus 60 degrees. Again, it's not set in concrete. It doesn't have to be exactly 60 degrees, but it just has to be in the ballpark. And this is the first stitch. Now from here we're going to use the distort and transform to build up our knitted stitch. So we want to select our shape and we're going to choose Effect and then Distort and Transform and Transform. I'm going to turn the preview on because I want to see what's happening. I need to see very clearly exactly what's happening, and I want to create a second stitch out here. So I'm going to click on Reflect Y, and I want one copy, so I'm just going to type one in here. So I'm going to end up with two stitches, and then I want to set the angle on this to 180 degrees. Now that's critical because what I want is an exact flipped copy of this shape. That's all that we're looking for here. And now let's start adjusting the horizontal value to move this shape relative to the other shape. Now I actually want this to look like a V, so I'm going to go in a minus horizontal direction. Now if you're not able to go far enough, if it won't go any further than minus 100, don't worry about that because it actually will go further. If you click in here and start pressing the down pointing arrow, you'll see that the minus 100 is not the furthest you can go, but of course I don't need to go nearly as far as that. So I'm just going to tip these two shapes so that they just about intersect, they just about touch each other. So whatever value I need, I'm just going to set it at that and then click OK. So here is the V of my stitches. I'm going to select the shape again. It's actually only this shape that is created so far, and I'm going to choose again Effect, Distort and Transform and then Transform. And I want to apply a new effect because I want to start seeing what this is going to look like when I add a few stitches. So again, I'm going to set preview on. I'm going to set copies just to 2 for now. We're going to change that a little bit later, but 2 is good for now. And now I'm going to start setting a vertical value to pull the copies away from each other. And I'm going to use a negative value just simply because it works a little bit better for me to see them arranged like this. So there are the beginnings of my stitches. I'm just going to click OK. Now I'm not perfectly happy with this, but the reason why I created this set of stitches was because I knew I wouldn't be happy with them, and I can now edit them. So I'm going to select over the shape so I can see just this area here. Now the only shape that I need to fix is this one here because all of these are just this shape here. So now I can come in with the direct selection tool, which is this white tool, or you can press the letter A to get it, and I'm just going to reshape this stitch, and I'm just looking for a stitch that is going to fill in these spaces a little bit. The last thing I want is all these spaces filled in. I don't want them filled in at completely, but I do want a little bit more filled in. Now I don't want this anchor point here, so I'm going to press the minus key to get the delete anchor point icon, and then just click on that, and then go back to the direct selection tool, just to reshape these stitches a little bit. Now this stitch, or sorry, this anchor point could be one of these anchor points. I'm just going to click on that just so that I can get access to two handles. Again, I'm just looking to create a nice stitch effect here. I don't think I want that anchor point either, so I'm going to just get rid of it. And by looking at the piece of fabric or the piece of stitches that I've got here, I can work out if I'm getting what I want, or just tweak it until I get it looking exactly as I want it to look, because these are then going to be my final stitches. Again, I don't think I want this anchor point either, so I'm going to get rid of it. Maybe just stretch this one up a little bit more. So you can continue working with this until you get the effect that you're looking for. Basically what you want is a gap in here, and you want the stitches to sort of nestle into each other a little bit, but not totally. So you can just bend these anchor points until you get the stitches that you want. So I'm going to call these pretty good for now, and let's go on to the next step. The next step is going to be actually creating our fabric from these stitches. So let's just zoom out. I'm going to press Ctrl and 0 to zoom out. Select over the entire shape, select the selection tool, and I'm just going to resize this shape because I want a smaller set of stitches. You could do that now or later on, it doesn't really matter. Now let's reselect this and let's go and do some more distort and transform. First of all, let's get the appearance panel, which I can get to by choosing window and then appearance. Now this second transform effect is the one that actually makes these two copies, so I can just edit it. So I'm just going to double click on it, make sure that this is the one that makes these two copies here, and because I really want just 30 copies, for example, I can just type 30 in here, click the preview on, and you can see I'm getting exactly the number of stitches that I want just by editing this existing transformation effect. So I'm going to do that and click OK. Let's just move this down. Again, remembering that this effect is really just this one stitch here. Now I'm thinking I've got way too many, so let's just take that back and see what 20 is going to look like. 20 is a lot better, so I'll just click OK. Now I want to repeat this in this direction, so I'm going to move it over here a little bit. I'm going to size it down because it is still a little on the big side. And now let's go and create another distort and transform effect. Distort and transform, transform. And yes, we do want a new effect. This time we want to copy it out in this direction. Turn preview on. Let's do 18 copies and let's move them in a horizontal direction. And I'm just going to increase this horizontal value until they form a V shape, so they look like a piece of knitted fabric. Now again, I've got too many copies, and I'm going to start decreasing this until I get the shape fabric that I want. So I'm thinking this is pretty good, so I'll click OK. So here is the basic fabric, and if I resize this one stitch, you'll see that the whole thing will resize appropriately. So having now created the stitches, we're ready to create the loops at the top, finish off the bottom, and give it a little bit more of a hand-drawn look. Before I go too much further, I'm not really happy with the colors I'm using here, so I'm going to target the fill color and choose a sort of light turquoise blue. And then let's go to the outside color, the stroke color, and let's add in a dark turquoise blue as the stroke. Now I'm going to save these colors in the color palette by just dragging and dropping them into the color palette so I can use them later on because I'm going to need them for some other stitches. Now with this single shape selected, I want to start making this look a little bit more hand drawn, so I need to expand it. Object, expand appearance, and that expands this into its component parts. Now let's go to the wrinkle tool. Now the wrinkle tool shares a toolbar position with the width tool, and it's down the bottom here. It's the wrinkle tool. And I need to change some settings for this, because by default when you open this, let's just reset the dialog. By default the horizontal setting is 0%, and I want to wrinkle in both a vertical and a horizontal direction, so I need to set this to 100%. I think the width is a little bit small, so I like to use a slightly bigger brush, so I'm going to set this back up to 200 points so that my brush size is larger. I don't need to change the angle because I'm using a circular brush, so changing the angle is going to have no effect at all anyway. But the intensity is going to have an effect. If I have a really high intensity, when I click on this, it's going to wrinkle really fast, and I would rather it did it slowly. So I'm going to use something between 5 and 10%, and we'll just settle for 5 right now and click OK. So they're the only changes I'm making. And now I'm just going to click on this shape, and as I do, you'll notice that it's subtly starting to wrinkle. Let's just zoom in so that you can see. You can see that these stitches now are not perfect, and we're getting a slightly more hand-drawn look to it. It's as if we drew each of these stitches by hand. And you'll also see that the fill and the stroke are behaving differently. Now, if you don't want that effect, don't use a stroke. So when you expand this, don't have a stroke around your stitches, just have the fill, and then you'll go ahead and wrinkle the fill and then add a stroke at the end, and the stroke will be perfect. But the effect I want is something that's sort of almost inked and painted, and so that the fact that the fills and the strokes are going in different directions is just perfect for the look that I'm going for. So I'm just going to wrinkle it until it looks nice and hand drawn. So we've lost the appearance of this being a really machine knitted fabric, if you like, and now we've got something that looks a lot more as if it were hand drawn. The next step is to create the loops that are going to go over the knitting needle. So I'm going to zoom in here so we can get a bit closer to where we're working, and I'm going to add a new layer by clicking the create new layer icon, and this creates a layer above the one we're working on. And I'm just going to lock down the layer that has the stitches so it won't move. I'm going to target the ellipse tool, and let's just drag out an ellipse for these loops. I'm just going to drag it into position and then just resize it. Now right now it's going over the top of the stitches, but in a few minutes we're going to put it behind. But for now let's put it on top. Now I want this to have a stroke that is the pale blue, so I'm going to reverse these colors and then just turn off the fill. So now we're just working with the stroke. I'm going to increase the stroke value to get a bigger loop, because this is theoretically the same sort of fiber as we're using in the knitting itself, so they should be about the same width. Now I can also use the width tool that shares this toolbar position with the wrinkle tool. If I click on the width tool, I can just adjust the shape of this line so I can make it narrower and wider to give it a little bit more of an organic look, so it's just not quite so even all the way around. Now I think I need to just adjust the bottom point here, as I think it's a little bit too rounded, so I'm going to select it with the direct selection tool and then hold the Alt key as I drag over its little handles here, because that allows me to adjust these handles independently of each other. So there's the loop that's going to go over the knitting needle. Let's drag this layer below the stitches layer so we can see how things are going to start to appear. I'm just going to move that up a little bit. And now I'm going to expand the appearance of this shape. So I'm going to choose Object, Expand Appearance. And then I'm going to, because you can see that in expanding the appearance, we've actually now created a fill rather than a stroke. Now we can go and stroke this line with our stroke color, and it's going to need a stroke to be about 2 points. Now the stroke here was 2 points and this is 2 points, and they look pretty different to me. So I'm just going to select this and go to the appearance panel, and I'm just going to adjust the actual stroke value because I think 2 points is not right. I think if I use something like 1.5, I'm going to get a better match for the stroke that I have down here. So I'm just going to do that. So now that I've got my appearance in place, let's just drag this shape up again, because we've got something happening here that's not particularly a good idea. So with this shape selected, let's just go to unite, and that will just unite it into a single shape so that we're losing that little twist at the bottom. And let's go and put it back where it came from. If it's a bit too high a loop, we can just make it a bit smaller by just adjusting its size. Now I would like it to have the appearance here that it is actually a loop. So right now it looks like a single loop of fiber, but I would like to sort of cut it at this point so that I get a stroke on that corner. Now the easiest way that I found to do this is to actually use the knife tool. So I'm going to go to the knife tool, which shares a toolbar position with the eraser. I'm just going to select the knife, and I'm just going to run a knife line along here. So with the knife, it's a bit tricky to draw with it, but I'm just going to draw it out. And now you can see that the shape that we've got looks a bit more like a loop of fiber, where this piece is actually going over the front of this piece. Let's zoom out again, and now let's put our shape back into position. And this will just ensure that wherever we're seeing it, if we see the bottom of this shape, that it's looking more like a loop and less like a circle of fiber. So let's just zoom out again. I'm going to this time just press Ctrl-0 so I can go all the way back out. And now let's repeat this across the knitting. So I'm going to choose Effect and Distort and Transform, and then Transform. And I want Preview turned on, and I'm probably going to need about 10 copies, but we can check that in a minute. And now I'm going to just start increasing this horizontal value to make the shapes go across here. Now I've done this in the past and the colors haven't gone with me, and so if your colors don't go, don't worry about that, because if it's like a hollow shape, you can just fill it again once you get it in place. But for now, this is looking fine for me, and I'm just spacing these out to 51.5 because that seems to put all the loops exactly where they should be, and 10 copies was fine. If I got that wrong, I could just decrease that value. But you're looking at placing a loop in between every single one of these sort of V shapes. So let's click OK. And now we're ready to go and create our knitting needle, and the knitting needle is going to start out just as a line. So I'm going to drag out a line here. I'm going to make it horizontal, so I'm just going to hold the Shift key as I draw it, and it's just got a stroke on it, and so I'm just going to increase the stroke value until it's big enough to double as a knitting needle. So I'm going to widen it quite a bit. But knitting needles are tapered a bit, so I'm going to target the width tool and just run a little bit of a change here. Well, first of all, I'm going to put a round stroke on the ends, because that's going to make it look a little bit more like a knitting needle. And then let's go in here with the width tool and just narrow this point down a little bit. And that's giving the impression of this being a little bit more of a knitting needle shape. And let's narrow this a little bit too. So that's pretty good for my knitting needle. I'm just going to add an end to it, which is going to be a rounded rectangle. So I'm just going to drag that over the end here. Let's just position it in place. I'm going to reverse the fill and stroke here so that this is a filled shape. I need to expand my path here, so I'm going to choose Object, Expand Appearance, so that now this is a filled path, and so is the tip of the knitting needle. I'm going to select over both, and from the Pathfinder just select Unite. So now my knitting needle is a single shape. I'm going to place it in position. Let's go and get our Layers panel, because that's going to be key to this. The Layers panel right now has the knitting needle here above the stitches, so I'm actually going to place it below the stitches because it's going to be a little bit easier to manage from here. Now I'm going to lock down my knitting needle layer, so I'm locking it, so whatever I'm going to do next is not going to affect it. This row of stitches here is just a single object right now, so I'm going to grab a hold of it and I'm going to choose Object, Expand Appearance. And that's going to make each one of these stitches a separate object. Now I'm going to zoom into this area so I can see clearly what I'm doing. And I'm going to use the eraser to erase away the part of the stitch that I don't want. So I'm going to make sure that I have my stitch layer selected. I'm going to grab hold of my eraser tool. I'm going to make sure that it is small enough so that I don't run the risk of going too far here. And I'm going to just erase over this layer in the area that covers the knitting needle. And when I do that, I think I've actually done not a particularly good job there. Let's try that again. But when I do that, I'm only affecting the stitch layer, and what we're doing is we're actually bringing the knitting needle visibly in front of the stitch. Now if you wanted to be really accurate with this, you could make paths and you could do it using the Pathfinder tools, but I think for this, given that it's given a sort of rustic look anyway, we're not going to be losing too much by actually using the eraser tool for this job. I just think that I'm making my eraser marks a little bit too big, so I'm actually going to allow for the fact that the stroke is going to be put on this path and not make it quite as big as I have been. So I'm just holding the Shift key as I'm moving the illustration across, and each time I'm just erasing one part of this loop. And this will make it look in a minute as if the loops are actually over the knitting needle, actually wound around the knitting needle. I'm just going to finish this up. There's 10 loops, 11 loops to do this too. It's not a particularly big task. You'll probably want to be a little bit more careful with yours than I am being, but again, because we're trying to get this sort of rustic hand-drawn look to this, the fact that this is not 100% accurate is really not going to show. Okay, let's just zoom out again, and you can see now that we've got the appearance of the knitting needle going through the fabric, but my knitting needle's a bit out of alignment here, so it's over the edge of the page, so I'm just going to push it through the shape here, and we can do that because the knitting needle is on its own layer and it was not affected. But I do think I've got a little bit of tidying up to do here because I need to do a little bit better erasing job on this piece here. So let's zoom back out. The next thing I need to do is to finish off the bottom of my stitches, and that's pretty easy. I'm just going to make some loops to do that with. So I'm going to target the pen tool and I'm just going to make a small horseshoe shape. Do that by dragging down and then just dragging up. And I'm going to set a stroke on this of my blue color, and again I'm going to increase this stroke value so that it's quite thick so it looks as if it's a stitch. Let's just zoom into this area and just reshape this to make it our loop. Again, it needs to have this sort of slightly hand-drawn look to it. Now for this stroke, I'm going to round the corners, so I'm going to the stroke area here and I'm going to round the tips on this because that's going to make it look a bit more like a stitch. I'm going to target the selection tool and just flatten it a little bit. And now let's take it and let's expand its appearance. Object, expand. And because it's only a stroke, I'm going to turn fill off and just click OK. And now we can stroke this shape with our stroke. And again, this stroke's going to have to be something like about 1.75 to match the rest of the shapes. So now I've got this, I'm ready to take it across. I can add a little wrinkle to it if I want to, just the tiniest of wrinkles. So just click on the wrinkle tool to wrinkle it a little bit. Let's press Ctrl-0 to zoom back out. I think it's still a little bit wide, so let's just adjust it a little bit. Move it into position and now let's duplicate it. So with it selected, I'm going to choose Effect, Distort and Transform. Transform. going to turn preview on. I think I'm going to need the same 10 copies, and then let's just adjust the horizontal value to move it out so that it appears underneath all of these stitches. And we had to make the loops 51.5, and this is going to have to be about 51.5 to be right as well. So I'll just click OK. And in the original I had a double layer of loops, so I'm going to just select the Alt key here and drag downwards, and that creates a second set of loops. I'm going to place the second set of loops offset from the first so that they're over the top of it, giving the bottom piece of this knitting a totally finished look. But you can see I've got one loop too many. Well, that's easily solved because I'm just going to select this particular shape. Let's click on its transform option here, and it had 10 copies, so let's just reduce that to 9, and that just lops off the one that we don't want. To finish off the piece, we're going to add a couple of little pieces of thread. When you start knitting, you'll have a little bit of thread here, and of course you'll have the thread that you're actually working with. And we'll duplicate this knitting needle to create the second set of needles. To create my thread, I'm just going to use the pen tool. I'm going to lock down everything that I have in place here and add a new layer for it because it's just a lot easier to do that. I'm going to click here to start my thread behind everything, and then just take it off in a sort of organic look. Now again, I want a light stroke. I want no fill at all. I want to increase my stroke amount so that it's quite a thick piece of thread, because this again would be that piece of fiber. I'm going to give it a curved end here. And because we're working just with a stroke, it's also possible to adjust this using the width tool. So I could make my stroke a little bit wider, my line a little bit wider if I want to, and a little bit narrower, again to give it the look of something that is a little bit more organic and rough in shape. Once I'm happy with this, I'm going to duplicate it. So I'm actually just going to select it and Alt drag a duplicate of it away, because it can solve the problem of my end piece over here. Let's just go and reshape it a little bit. I'm going to widen up the stroke value and then rotate it, and it can then be the piece that is in here that's the last bit of the knitting. So I'm just going to take its width down a little bit because I think it's a bit thick. This one perhaps a little bit too wide as well. I'm going to select this shape, Object Expand Appearance, and again I'm going to add the stroke to this. And its stroke needs to be about 1.75, so I can just manually type that in. And I'm going to add the same effect here, Object Expand Appearance, and go ahead and give it the same stroke and the same point value at 1.75. And now all we need is a second copy of our knitting needle. So I'm going to go and unlock my layer that contains my knitting needle. I'm going to locate the knitting needle. Here it is, it's locked down as well. So I'm just going to duplicate this layer, and then I'm going to take one of these knitting needles and then just move it out of the way and rotate it. Now the only thing that concerns me about this piece of knitting is that although it looks hand drawn here, there's no variation in the edge, and if it were hand drawn it would probably have some variation. So I'm going to go and grab this stitches layer. So I'm looking at this particular layer here. I'm going to add to it this set of stitches, so I need to locate those and add them. And I think that they're here. So these two layers here are these stitches. So I'm going to move each of these layers up into the stitches layer so that they're all going to travel together. So let's just move them up into here. Having done that, I'm going to select all the things that are on this layer, which is this bottom row of stitches and the stitches themselves, and I'm going to make a group out of them. So I'm going to choose Object and Group. And now what I'm going to do is warp this. So with this group selected, I'm going to choose Object, Envelope Distort, Make with Warp. Now the default is arc, and that's obviously not what we want. So I'm going to select a different kind of a warp, and flag is going to work really well for me. It's going to work well for me, except that obviously horizontal's not the kind of setting I want. But if I choose vertical, then the sweep is going to be in a vertical direction. And all I want to do is back off this amount, because 50% is obviously way too much. But if I bring it down to a very small value, such as 5 or 4 or 3, we're getting just the right amount of twist in this knitting that is suggesting that it could be hand drawn. It's just adding to the appearance. So I've actually just set this to 3. I can play around with these distort values and see if any of them would help me. Obviously horizontal is not going to work, because that's going to pull the stitches away at the top here, but vertical might give me some interest. So I could actually adjust the vertical a little bit, again to reinforce the idea that this is a hand drawn image and it's not been created with the full power of Illustrator to be exactly neat and accurate. So let's just do that and click OK. Now, one of the other things that we can do before we go is to actually add some variety to our knitting, because our stitches don't all have to be blue. So let's see how we would add something like a pattern to our stitches. Now, I did just notice that the flag warp really hasn't done me any favors up at the top here. So I'm going to turn off one of the settings that I made. So I'm just going to re-choose Object, Envelope Distort, Reset with Warp, because that allows me access to this dialog, so I can just reset any of the settings that are not working for me. I'm still leaving the bend in place, but I'm just taking off the vertical distortion that was causing me a bit of distress there. Now, to recolor my shape, I'm going to select all the stitches here, and I'm going to choose Object and then Expand, and just click OK. And this expands this into its component pieces. So I can get access to them. I'm going to choose Object and then Ungroup. And I'm going to do that repeatedly until I can no longer ungroup things. In other words, until they're all ungrouped. And now at this point, the Ungroup option is not available. Now, if you don't want to see what's happening here, you can just close that down if it's a little bit scary, because you don't really need it. And now let's go and draw our heart. I'm actually going to create a heart in this piece of stitching. So I'm going to select the selection tool. I'm going to select on the first of my stitches. So this is going to be the bottom of my heart. And I'm going to need to select about 10 stitches up here. So I'm just going to shift and click on each of these stitches in turn. It may be easier if you just zoom in so you can see things more clearly. Again, let's go and get the selection tool. So I'm going to select a pair of stitches. I'm going to add each new pair. And here are my 10 stitches selected. I'm just going to recolor them. Now, when you're selecting your stitches, if you were actually knitting, you would be creating each one of these is a single stitch. So a single stitch is a V shape. So you want to make sure that you select exactly what you need to. Now I'm going to select 9 coming down here. I'm just going to recolor those, and if you miss one, it's very easy just to pick it up. And the last one on the outside is going to be about 8 of them, so I'm just going to grab 8. And then let's go and do the same thing on the other side. It might take you some trial and error if you want to create an element using stitches, because stitches are not properly square, so you can't actually use a piece of regular graph paper to graph it out. You would need to use something that's a little bit more rectangular. So as I said, a little bit of trial and error to get the shape right. And now press Ctrl 0, and there's our heart shape in our piece of fabric. In fact, I think probably I would add a little bit more in here. grab this stitch here and then the rest of this stitch here. So there you have an idea for creating a hand-drawn piece of knitting in Illustrator. It is largely a case of creating your basic shapes, repeating them, and then giving them the hand-drawn look with a warp and perhaps with the use of the wrinkle tool. We also used a eraser to put the stitches behind the knitting needle itself. And then finally we expanded and ungrouped everything so that we could put a pattern into our knitting. I'm Helen Bradley. Thank you for joining me for this video tutorial. Look out for more of my video tutorials here on my YouTube channel, and consider subscribing to my channel and you'll be alerted when new videos are released. And visit my website at projectwoman.com, where you'll find more tips, tricks and tutorials on a range of applications including Photoshop, Lightroom, Illustrator and a whole lot more.